Ah, royalty. The glimmering crowns, the velvet robes, the centuries of inherited wealth, and of course the occasional public execution, inter-family betrayal, and complete collapse of empires because someone couldn't stop marrying their cousin. Today, we're diving deep into history's most gloriously dysfunctional royal families. These aren't just bad rulers, these are the families that made people say, maybe democracy isn't such a bad idea after all. Hello travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button. But only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The Habsburgs. Too inbred to function. Let's start with the Habsburgs. The royal family that ruled half of Europe and still managed to collapse under the weight of their own family tree, which, to be honest, looked less like a tree and more like a tangled set of earbuds from 2003. A family tree so entangled, it needed a warning label. May cause chin enlargement and dynastic extinction. These folks were the monarchic equivalent of, I don't need new friends, I already have cousins. Their philosophy was simple: keep the power in the bloodline, no matter how questionable that blood became. Over generations, this led to marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins, and probably a family reunion that required a medical team on standby. By the time Charles II of Spain showed up in 1661, the genetic dice had been rolled so many times that the universe just gave up and dropped them under the couch. Charles II is often referred to as the Bewitched, though frankly, he didn't need witchcraft. Just several centuries of terrible matchmaking. He inherited a royal mess. A Spain on the decline. Nobles who hated each other more than they hated France, which is saying something, and a body that was basically a poorly constructed IKEA project. Missing screws, wobbly joints, and no clear instructions. Charles suffered from a jaw so massive and misaligned, he couldn't properly chew food, a tongue so oversized. His speech was often unintelligible, making royal proclamations sound like someone gargling Latin through a pillow. Developmental delays that made even courtiers whisper, "Are we sure he's the king?" And total infertility, which meant centuries of royal inbreeding led to a king who couldn't make more royals. Imagine being so inbred that your entire royal bloodline ends with you, despite the fact that you're surrounded by gold, churches, and 15 advisors screaming, "Try harder." His medical record reads like a tragic poem: epilepsy, digestive disorders, frequent infections, premature aging, and eventually, death at age 38, after years of being what can only be described as a walking argument against cousin marriage. But Charles was just the end result. The whole Habsburg dynasty had issues. Earlier Habsburg emperors were no picnic either. Philip II of Spain, Charles's great-grandfather, for instance, married his cousin, and then his niece, and then his fourth cousin, once removed. The family motto may as well have been, love is patient, love is kind, love is also genetically hazardous. And yet, for centuries, they ruled everything from Austria to Spain, the Netherlands, and big chunks of Italy, and the Americas. That's right, entire continents were managed by people who thought a good marriage policy was, do we share great-grandparents? Perfect. Their downfall wasn't just biological. The Habsburgs had a habit of managing empire like a drunk man assembling flat-pack furniture. Lots of banging, poor planning, and the occasional total collapse. By the late 17th century, Spain's military was bankrupt, its population starving, and its leader drooling on royal carpets. When Charles II died without an heir, the Habsburg dynasty in Spain collapsed like a Jenga tower with a rat infestation. His death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, where Europe's major powers fought over who got to inherit the empty, sad shell of what was once Habsburg Spain. Imagine dying and causing a war because your jaw was too big and your genes too narrow. It wasn't just Spain either. Over in Austria, the Habsburgs kept rolling the same genetic dice and wondering why things weren't improving. Eventually, by the 19th century, they had shifted focus to wearing more medals than common sense and stumbling their way into World War I, helped along by Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination lit the match for the global bonfire. So let's summarize. The Habsburgs ruled Europe for over 600 years. They had gold, land, castles, and power. They also had such an intense inbreeding problem that their royal portraits started looking like caricatures drawn by someone holding the pencil with their feet. And when their empire finally cracked apart, It wasn't with a bang, but with the long, exhausted sigh of a dynasty that had spent centuries sleeping with itself. Next time someone tells you about the glory of the old world and the divine right of kings, just remind them that one of the most powerful families in Europe couldn't figure out that marrying your niece might not be a good idea. The Romanovs. How to lose a throne in one revolution. If the Habsburgs were undone by centuries of marrying their cousins, the Romanovs were undone by a slightly more modern mistake, trusting a sketchy wizard with a beard that looked like it had its own zip code. The Romanovs ruled Russia for over 300 years. That's 3 full centuries of Tsars, crowns, cold winters, and decisions that ranged from harsh but effective to what in the icy hell were you thinking? They came to power in 1613, when Mikhail Romanov, a teenager with roughly 0 political experience, was offered the throne because everyone else was either dead, exiled, or just very tired of civil war. Mikhail took the job, probably because he was too polite to say no, and so began one of the most dramatic dynasties in history. Let's fast forward to the final season of this royal disaster series. Nicholas II, Russia's last Tsar, and a man who looked like someone put a military uniform on a confused librarian. Nicholas wasn't necessarily evil, just catastrophically unprepared for the job. His qualifications for ruling a massive empire included being born royal, having a beard, and that's about it. If you've ever been promoted to manager because you've been here the longest, you've got Nicholas II energy. Now, to be fair, Nicholas inherited a hot mess. The Russian Empire in the late 19th century was an industrial snail racing into the modern world with a population of starving peasants, a rebellious working class, and more political unrest than a Twitter thread about pineapple on pizza. But instead of reforming the system, Nicholas did the royal equivalent of putting duct tape on a sinking ship and praying, and then he made it worse. How? 2 words. Grigory Rasputin. Ah yes, Rasputin. The holy man, the mystic, the self-proclaimed healer with eyes like a hypnotized raccoon and personal hygiene that could probably end a small kingdom. Rasputin wormed his way into the royal family after claiming he could heal the Tsar's son Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia, a condition that turned every scraped knee into a medical emergency. To be fair, he did seem to calm the boy's symptoms, possibly through hypnosis, prayer, or sheer force of body odor. Nicholas's wife, Alexandra, became obsessed with Rasputin. She trusted him more than her own advisors, which is sort of like replacing your doctor with a guy you met at Burning Man. Soon, Rasputin was influencing government decisions, making ministerial appointments, and reportedly sleeping with half the aristocracy. The Russian people, already fed up with high taxes, food shortages, and losing wars, saw this circus and thought, you know what, maybe it's revolution o'clock. Meanwhile, Nicholas continued to make questionable life choices. He took Russia into the Russo-Japanese War, which went so badly that even Japan was shocked by how easy it was. He handled the 1905 revolution with classic autocratic grace by shooting protesters. And when World War I started, he personally took command of the army, despite knowing absolutely nothing about military strategy. That's like your dentist volunteering to fly a 747 because how hard can it be? By 1917, Russia was done. Soldiers were mutinying, factories were closed, bread was scarce, and Rasputin had been assassinated after being poisoned, shot, stabbed, and drowned in that order. Apparently he refused to die until someone just unplugged him from the simulation. Nicholas was forced to abdicate. He and his family were sent into house arrest, which sounds cozy until you realize that in 1918, the Bolsheviks lined up the entire Romanov family, including the kids, and shot them in a basement. Brutal, tragic, and the official end of the Russian monarchy. And thus, the Romanov dynasty collapsed, not because of a war, or a rebellion, or even a foreign invasion, but because a Tsar didn't know how to adapt to change, and let a creepy bearded man hijack his empire like a Rasputin-shaped malware. Summary: the Romanovs ruled Russia for over 300 years. Their final Tsar ignored reform, bungled war, and got hypnotized by a medieval Jedi. Their dynasty ended in a basement, during one of history's bleakest family portraits, and all because Nicholas thought trusting a mystic over his ministers was a good idea. You'd think, if history taught us anything, it's maybe listen to your advisors, or at least don't invite magical swamp men into your political decision-making. The Tudors, If looks could kill, Henry VIII would still be beheading wives. Now let's talk about the Tudors, England's royal drama factory. If the Habsburgs were inbred and the Romanovs were cursed, the Tudors were just one man with way too much power and not nearly enough marriage counselling. At the centre of it all was Henry VIII, a man so obsessed with having a son that he racked up wives like unpaid parking tickets. He was charming, athletic, and considered handsome in his youth, though by middle age he resembled a ham that had been left in the sun and given a crown. He ruled from 1509 to 1547, and in those 38 years he created the Church of England just so he could get a divorce, married 6 times, executed 2 of his wives, bankrupted the treasury, ate so much meat he practically sweated gravy. Let's break it down by wives, because this man's love life was a historical horror movie, with chapters. Wife hash 1. Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was his brother's widow, so technically this marriage started with a raised eyebrow from the Pope. She was intelligent, regal, and gave birth to Mary, a daughter, but Henry wanted a son, desperately, obsessively, as in, let's throw out an entire religion, levels of desperate. When the Pope wouldn't grant a divorce, Henry said, "Cool, I'll just make my own church," which is the 1500s equivalent of being banned from a pub and building a new one across the street. Catherine refused to step aside, and Henry spent years trying to wiggle out of the marriage like a toddler in church clothes. Wife hash 2. Anne Boleyn. Anne was younger, flirtier, and a political firework. Henry married her in secret, crowned her queen, and finally got another daughter, Elizabeth. You know, the one who'd later become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Yeah, her. Henry, disappointed again, accused Anne of witchcraft, adultery, and incest. Basically spinning the wheel of medieval excuses. She was beheaded, with an executioner imported from France to do it neatly. How thoughtful. Her final words were dignified and calm, probably because she knew Henry's next wife wouldn't fare much better. Wife hash 3. Jane Seymour. Jane gave Henry the thing he wanted most, a son, Edward. Tragically, she died shortly after childbirth, and Henry never said a bad word about her again. Of course not. She died before she had the chance to disappoint him. That's the real Tudor love story. Wife hash 4. Anne of Cleves. This one was arranged based on a portrait. Henry saw her in person and declared she looked nothing like the painting. She looks like a horse, he reportedly said, which is rich, coming from a man whose waistline was measured in circumference units, not inches. They never consummated the marriage, divorced amicably, and Anne got to live. In fact, she outlived all of Henry's other wives, and was given the royal equivalent of "thanks for participating" money. Wife hash 5. Catherine Howard Young. Beautiful, and let's say romantically enthusiastic. Catherine was Henry's midlife crisis in a corset. She was also unfaithful, possibly because her husband was 50 obese, infected with leg ulcers, and smelled like cooked cheese. She was beheaded too. Pattern recognition. Anyone? Wife hash 6. Catherine Parr. The final wife, and the one who outlived Henry. Smart, politically savvy, and very careful not to breathe wrong. She probably spent their marriage quietly updating her will, and looking out the window like a prisoner with tenure. So, to recap, divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. That's the cheat sheet for Henry's wives. Henry VIII changed religion, broke alliances, and killed 2 spouses, all in the name of needing a son. Ironically, his greatest legacy was Elizabeth I, a daughter he didn't want, who ruled for 44 years and made England a global power. Henry, meanwhile, died obese, paranoid, and smelling like regret and roasted pig. In short, if your Tinder history looks bad, just remember, at least your dating life didn't require an act of parliament and a public execution. The Bonapartes, family values and Napoleonic nepotism are the Bonapartes. A royal family in the sense that one very short man decided, you know what, I'm emperor now, and then spent the next decade crowning his relatives like he was running a royal-themed pyramid scheme. At the center of this powdered hurricane was Napoleon Bonaparte, military genius, political mastermind, and man so insecure about his height that he tried to conquer Europe like it owed him an apology. Napoleon didn't inherit a throne, he just took one, like a raccoon taking over a campsite. And once he had it, oh boy, did he spread the power around. He turned the Bonaparte family into the Walmart of monarchies, one in every region, and quality wildly inconsistent. Let's meet the dysfunctional cast. Joseph Bonaparte, the reluctant king of things. He didn't want Napoleon's older brother, Joseph, was not exactly made for ruling. He wanted to sip wine in Italy and write poetry, not govern entire nations. But Napoleon didn't care. Congratulations, Joseph. You're the king of Naples. Ah. Okay. Also, now you're the king of Spain. Wait, what? Joseph was so bad at being king that the Spanish people revolted almost immediately. Which, to be fair, is what happens when your new monarch speaks French, knows nothing about your culture, and rules like he's trying to finish a homework assignment he didn't read. Napoleon kept shoving Joseph onto thrones like a stage mom at a cursed beauty pageant. Lucien Bonaparte, the brother with a brain and a backbone. Lucien was one of the few Bonapartes who had some political talent, and, more importantly, the ability to say, "No, Napoleon, that's a dumb idea." Napoleon hated that. Lucien refused to marry who Napoleon told him to marry, and was basically banished from the family's royal sitcom. In return, he lived a relatively peaceful life with his dignity intact, which might make him the real winner of the Bonaparte drama. Louis Bonaparte, King of Holland briefly and badly. Napoleon made his brother Louis King of Holland. Louis tried to take the job seriously, and even learned Dutch, which was very sweet. Unfortunately, Napoleon didn't want a King of Holland. He wanted a French puppet who would do exactly what he said. When Louis started making decisions for the good of the Dutch people, instead of for Napoleon's ego, Napoleon basically yeeted him off the throne and annexed Holland. Louis went into exile, his main contribution to history, siring Napoleon III, who we'll get to in a moment. Spoiler, things don't improve. Caroline Bonaparte, scheming in high heels. Napoleon's sister Caroline, was ruthless, ambitious, and married to Joachim Murat, one of Napoleon's generals who dressed like a dragoon-themed disco ball. Caroline maneuvered her way into becoming Queen of Naples, which sounds impressive until you realize everyone Napoleon put in. Naples had about the same job security as a fruit fly. She was politically savvy, deeply manipulative, and probably one of the few people in the family who could actually govern without burning down a country by accident. Think Cersei Lannister, but with more embroidery and fewer dragons. Napoleon II, the son who never really got a chance. Napoleon's only legitimate son, nicknamed the King of Rome at birth, had a title that was more decorative than useful. He was 1 year old when his father abdicated the throne, and after that his royal career consisted mostly of being a hostage in Austria. He died at 21 from tuberculosis, having ruled absolutely nothing, and achieving fame mainly for being the kid who got stuck holding the royal bag when everything collapsed. Basically, Napoleon II was the historical equivalent of being born into a startup that imploded before your first birthday. Napoleon III, the sequel, nobody asked for. Fast forward a few decades, and the Bonaparte family somehow makes a comeback through Louis Napoleon, the son of Louis Bonaparte. He styled himself Napoleon III because nothing says stable leadership like naming yourself after your exiled uncle. He became president of France, then staged a coup, then declared himself emperor, and to his credit, things went okay for about 15 years. Then he decided to go to war with Prussia, lost spectacularly, and was captured while trying to flee. His reign ended with him in British exile, where he spent his final years muttering about better days, and probably regretting not just opening a vineyard. So what went wrong? Napoleon built a family empire on charisma, conquest, and very shaky foundations. His siblings were mostly underqualified, over-promoted, or deeply confused by geography. The Bonaparte royal experiment was less Game of Thrones and more The Office, if Michael Scott ran an empire. In the end, the Bonapartes were proof that you can conquer a continent, but you can't make your family good at their jobs. The Stuarts, divine right, civil wars, and too many Charleses. The Stuarts, the royal family that believed they were chosen by God to rule, and then proceeded to rule like they were chosen by a very confused lottery machine. This was a family that took divine right to such ludicrous extremes that even God probably peeked in occasionally and said, "Okay, I didn't approve that decision." The Stuarts reigned over England, Scotland, and Ireland, and instead of uniting these lands, they mostly united everyone in a shared feeling of Please make it stop. Let's roll out the Royal Rogues Gallery. James the First. The first Stuart and the original drama magnate. James the First of England. Also James the Sixth of Scotland. Because why have one name when you can confuse your subjects? Was the first Stuart king to rule both countries. He was intelligent, scholarly, and convinced he had been personally handpicked by heaven to sit on the throne. Unfortunately, his heavenly vision didn't extend to personal hygiene. He famously rarely bathed, had a lisp, and kept a suspicious number of male favourites in his court that made the more conservative nobles raise their powdered eyebrows. He wrote books on witchcraft, tobacco, and political theory, which is basically the 1600s version of having a conspiracy podcast, a Substack, and a Twitter account at the same time. Charles I, the king who forgot he couldn't just ignore Parliament, enter Charles I, James's son, and the human embodiment of I do what I want. Charles was a quiet, refined man who loved art, religion, and completely bypassing Parliament like it was a speed bump on his divine right road trip. He ruled with all the charm of a snooty waiter and the flexibility of a brick. When Parliament dared to question his decisions, Charles responded by dissolving it, repeatedly, like he was breaking up with the same toxic ex, over and over again. Eventually, this led to a little something called the English Civil War, in which Charles raised an army of royalists. Parliament raised an army of please stop raising taxes without asking. The people picked sides like it was the world's worst family reunion dodgeball game. Spoiler, Charles lost twice, and unlike other royals who get exiled when they mess up, he got beheaded. That's right, Charles I became the first and only English king to get a very permanent haircut from his own people. Intermission. The Republic. Nobody really wanted. After Charles lost his head, England became a republic, led by Oliver Cromwell, who had the personality of a cold bowl of oatmeal and the fashion sense of a Puritan accountant. Cromwell banned fun. No theatre, no Christmas celebrations, no drunken shenanigans. Basically, he ruled England like it was an angry HR department. By the time he died, everyone missed the monarchy, even the bad parts. And so, like a cancelled TV show that got rebooted with worse writers, the Stuarts returned. Charles II, party king of the Restoration. Now we have Charles the Descend, son of the beheaded Charles I, and the exact opposite of his dad. Where his father was rigid and self-righteous, Charles II was charming, loose-living, and had the moral compass of a tipsy raccoon. He was called the Merry Monarch, which is historical code for spent most of his reign throwing parties and dodging responsibility. Charles had no legitimate heirs, but he made up for it by fathering at least a dozen illegitimate children with an impressive variety of mistresses. His court was a mix of royalty, scandal, perfume, powdered wigs, and at least one guy who probably played the lute half naked. When asked why he didn't have a proper heir, he probably just winked and handed someone a goblet of wine. Still, people liked Charles. He was fun, and after years of Cromwell's no smiling rule, England was ready for a bit of royal chaos with eyeliner. James II, the guy who blew it all up again. And then came James II, Charles's brother, and the monarch equivalent of a hangover. Where Charles II was flirtatious and politically careful, James was like, let's bring Catholicism back. In a country that had spent 100 years trying to get away from Catholicism, this did not go well. He was also very into the whole divine right thing, like Charles I, and started ignoring Parliament, also like Charles I, which is kind of like looking at the guy who slipped on a banana peel and thinking, ah yes, let me do exactly that. Eventually, the nobles looked at James and said, this again, and decided to replace him in what became known as the Glorious Revolution, a polite coup where they imported William and Mary from the Netherlands, like a better royal software update. James II fled to France, where he spent the rest of his life writing letters and sulking in Catholic. So what went wrong? The Stuarts couldn't decide whether they were kings or martyrs. They swung between repression and partying like a pendulum with a drinking problem. They believed so strongly in divine right that they repeatedly forgot human politics existed. In the end, the Stuarts were proof that thinking you're chosen by God doesn't help if Parliament is busy sharpening an axe. The Wittelsbachs, Bavaria's most fashionably unhinged royals. If Germany had a royal family that felt like the result of feeding fairy tales into a fever dream generator, it would be the Wittelsbachs. This Bavarian dynasty ruled on and off for centuries, And while they didn't conquer half the world or get famously guillotined, they more than made up for it with sheer eccentric energy, political misfires, and enough palace intrigue to power an opera house for a decade. Ludwig the Mad King, who built Disney's dream house. Let's start with their most famous train wreck, King Ludwig II, aka the Swan King, aka the Fairy Tale King, aka the guy who treated national debt like monopoly money. Ludwig ascended the throne in 1864, at the age of 18, and almost immediately decided he was not interested in ruling. What he was interested in was castles, Wagnerian opera, moonlit gondola rides in his man-made underground lake. You see, Ludwig didn't govern, he designed palaces, one of which, Neuschwanstein Castle, became the literal inspiration for Disneyland's Cinderella Castle. That's right, Walt Disney saw Ludwig's home and said, "That, but with churros." Ludwig's leadership style could best be described as, what if Versailles was built by someone high on absinthe and horn solos? He went broke, spectacularly broke. At one point, he was borrowing money from every royal cousin he had left, which was awkward because he never invited them over. Why? Because Ludwig hated people. He mostly dined alone and wrote fan mail to Richard Wagner like a medieval theatre kid with a royal budget. Eventually, his ministers declared him insane, a diagnosis suspiciously convenient for people tired of paying for golden swan-shaped furniture. He was institutionalized in a remote castle and mysteriously drowned days later in a shallow lake alongside his doctor. Bavaria ruled it a suicide. Historians ruled it sketchy. Conspiracy theorists ruled it our Super Bowl. Otto the brother who was officially bananas. But wait, Ludwig had a brother who was, somehow, even less stable. Prince Otto technically became king after Ludwig's death. Emphasis on technically, because Otto was completely and publicly mentally ill, suffering from delusions and violent episodes. He once tried to shoot the moon with a pistol in front of his staff. Otto was promptly declared unfit to rule and spent the rest of his life in genteel confinement, aka a palace with really nice curtains and absolutely no access to sharp objects. While Otto was officially king, Bavaria appointed a prince regent, first his uncle, then his cousin, to do the actual ruling. This resulted in decades of having two kings, one who thought the moon was out to get him, and one who just wanted to keep the lights on and the taxes low. The family traits, money trouble, mood swings, and lots of porcelain the Wittelsbachs had. A thing for excessive architecture, a tendency to treat statecraft like a musical intermission, a hereditary streak of mental illness that nobody talked about at dinner, but was painfully obvious in court records. They were patrons of the arts, romantics at heart, and collectively had the political instincts of a raccoon with a violin. Bavaria eventually gave up on monarchy altogether, not with a bang but with a theatrical shrug. So what went wrong? They were artists, not administrators. They believed the crown was a mood board, not a responsibility. They didn't fall so much as float away into the mists of eccentricity and debt. The Wittelsbachs are proof that you can build the prettiest castle in Europe and still lose your throne if you forget that people like roads, laws, and maybe fewer indoor swan fountains. The Pahlavis of Iran, oil, opulence, and one revolution later. Let's be clear, the Pahlavis weren't ancient royalty. They didn't descend from Cyrus the Great or ride into battle on golden horses. They started the old-fashioned way with a military coup and a big mustache. Reza Shah, the founding father, with a fist of iron and no chill. The dynasty began with Reza Shah Pahlavi, a former military officer who rose to power in 1925 by politely asking the Qajar dynasty to leave. And by politely I mean he staged a coup and said, "This is mine now." Reza Shah was a modernizer. And by modernizer we mean the kind of man who banned traditional clothing, forced people into Western suits, built railroads, universities, and an industrial base, at gunpoint if necessary. Think of him as Iran's grumpy dad, strict, efficient, not emotionally available, but deeply invested in national infrastructure. He also hated foreign meddling, which is unfortunate because Iran has oil, and oil is basically a flashing neon sign that says, "Please colonize me." Eventually, the British and Soviets got annoyed that Reza Shah wasn't playing nice during WWI, so they forced him to abdicate and shipped him off to South Africa like an imperial Amazon return. Mohammad Reza Shah, the Peacock Throne's shakiest tenant, enter his son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, aka the Shah, aka the guy who thought champagne and secret police were equally important parts of governance. Mohammad Reza was handsome, Western educated, and about as politically savvy as a box of decorative figs. His reign began in 1941, and while he tried to act like a constitutional monarch at first, he quickly realized he preferred being an absolute monarch with a side of French caviar. The glitz. What could possibly go wrong? This man loved a party. His crowning achievement, pun aggressively intended, was the 1971 Persepolis celebration, a multi-day, multi-million-dollar event celebrating 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. It featured imported French chefs 50,000 songbirds released into the desert. They died, luxury tents with air conditioning in the middle of nowhere, and a guest list of global elites including Emperor Haile Selassie, Prince Rainier of Monaco, and everyone who still liked him. The tents alone cost more than the GDP of some of his provinces. It was a party so absurdly lavish, it made Versailles look like a soup kitchen. Meanwhile, back in Iran, people were hungry, unemployed, and being beaten senseless by Savak, the Shah's secret police, who had the subtlety of a brick and the compassion of a malfunctioning toaster. The politics, a masterclass in alienation. Here's what Mohammad Reza Shah did not understand. His people were devout Muslims. Many were poor and disillusioned. Westernization felt more like cultural bulldozing than progress. Instead of listening, the Shah doubled down on Western clothes, forced land reforms, rigged elections and shiny things. He wanted Iran to be a modern secular powerhouse. But you can't run a country like a luxury showroom, especially not when your showroom has gold toilets and your population doesn't have clean water. The revolution, Ruhollah brings receipts. Enter Ayatollah Khomeini, a fiery cleric in exile, who had a long beard, a longer list of grievances, and the ability to turn cassette tapes into revolution. That's right, the Islamic Revolution was partially powered by bootleg sermons on cassette tapes, smuggled into Iran like spiritual mixtapes. By 1979, the people had had enough. Protests erupted, the military split. The Shah fled the country like a man running from a dinner bill the size of Belgium. And the monarchy? Poof. Gone. Replaced with the Islamic Republic, where turbans replaced tiaras and nobody ever threw parties in the desert again. So what went wrong? Too much show, not enough substance. Too many palaces, not enough public trust. Too many arrests, not enough actual listening. The Pahlavis mistook being admired for being loved and being rich for being safe. Spoiler, they were none of the above. Today, Mohammad Reza's son, Reza Pahlavi II, lives in exile and occasionally gives TED Talk-style interviews about freedom and democracy. But the peacock throne, still gathering dust in a museum of how not to monarchy, the Merovingians, long hair, short reigns, and even shorter tempers. The Merovingians are basically the rock stars of early medieval Europe. Except instead of guitars, they had long flowing hair, and instead of chart-topping hits, they had a lot of family drama and barely their governance. Long hair, don't care. The defining trait of the Merovingians was their long hair. This wasn't just a fashion statement, it was the ultimate symbol of royal power. Cut a Merovingian's hair, and you basically ended their career faster than a bad Instagram post. Imagine a bunch of kings with luscious locks that made shampoo commercials jealous, but also made them suspiciously fragile. One bad haircut, and boom, down to peasant status. They believed their hair was magical, or at least very important, so they kept it long, shiny, and untouched by barbers. So untouched that sometimes their hygiene habits could be described as medieval swamp chic. Clovis, the founder and original hair icon. The story starts with Clovis I, who ruled from 481 to 511 AD, was the first Merovingian king to unite the Frankish tribes. He was a big deal because he converted to Christianity, which was a smart political move. Basically the medieval equivalent of liking the right influencer. He expanded his territory like he was playing Risk on hard mode, and he rocked that long hair like a true boss. The lazy kings and the mayors of the palace. Here's where it gets fun. After a few generations of Merovingian kings, something weird happened. The kings got lazy, like really lazy. Most of the ruling power shifted to the mayors of the palace, basically the king's chief of staff, but with a little more ambition and a lot less hair. These mayors started running the kingdom while the Merovingian kings just sat around, twirling their glorious locks and occasionally showing up for coronations. One of these mayors was Charles Martel. Yes, the grandfather of Charlemagne. He was basically the guy who cleaned up the mess the Merovingians left behind. The do-nothing kings. Many Merovingian kings were called ros fainéants or do-nothing kings. Imagine a king whose job description was literally just look regal and do nothing else. Picture a medieval version of a reality TV show star. Lots of drama, flashy hair, minimal actual responsibility. These kings would often bicker with each other, fight pointless wars, and leave the real decisions to their mayors. It's like they wanted the crown but none of the work. Kind of like that one cousin who always borrows your stuff and never returns it. Childeric III, the last long-haired king. The dynasty limped along until Childeric III, the last Merovingian king. By the time he came around in the mid-700s, say, the mayors of the palace had had enough of lazy kings and wanted a proper CEO. So Pepin the Short, Charles Martel's son, and a mayor of the palace with big ambitions and even bigger muscles, marched into the scene. Pepin basically said, "Hey Pope, can you make me king instead? Because this guy with the awesome hair isn't cutting it." The Pope agreed, because politics, and in 751 AD, Pepin was crowned, ending Merovingian rule and kicking off the Carolingian dynasty. Merovingian legacy. Great hair, terrible leadership. So what did the Merovingians leave us? A legacy of legendary hair care. Seriously, if Instagram existed, they'd be influencers. Kings who prove that long hair doesn't guarantee long reigns. A political power struggle that's basically the medieval version of The Office, but with more swords and less productivity. Fun fact, the mystery of the Merovingian bloodline. If you've ever watched The Da Vinci Code, or read any conspiracy theories, you might have heard whispers about the Merovingians being the mysterious holy bloodline. Their long hair became a symbol of secret royal power, inspiring legends of lost descendants and hidden kingdoms. So basically, they were the medieval version of a celebrity family everyone's convinced is hiding a huge scandal, except their scandal was bad leadership and a bad haircut ending. So there you have it, the Merovingians, kings with hair so long it was practically a government expense, but reigns so short and temper so volatile. It's no wonder the mayors of the palace had to step in and save the day. The Qing dynasty, Q hair, forbidden palaces, and very bad timing. The Qing dynasty ruled China from 1644 to 1912, which is a good long run if you can ignore the fact that their final century looked like a soap opera with warlords, foreign invaders, and emperors who basically had one hand on the throne and the other on their Q hairstyle. Q hair, the ultimate hair police. One of the Qing's most famous and infamous traits was the Q, a hairstyle that looked like a mullet on steroids. Imagine shaving your forehead bare and braiding the rest of your hair into a long ponytail that swings behind you like a tail on a very confused dragon. This wasn't just a hairstyle, it was a symbol of loyalty. The Manchu rulers ordered every Han Chinese man to adopt the Q as a sign of submission. Refuse, and you risked losing your head. Literally, this forced haircut wasn't exactly a hit. It sparked several rebellions and became a daily reminder that the Qing had some serious hair enforcement issues. If you think bad haircuts are just a personal tragedy, imagine a whole country's men being told, "This is your new look, like it or else." Forbidden City, the ultimate do not disturb zone. The Qing emperors ruled from the Forbidden City, an enormous palace complex in Beijing, so exclusive it makes modern celebrity mansions look like a Motel 6. The name says it all. Forbidden. Commoners weren't allowed in, foreign diplomats could only visit with strict supervision, and palace intrigue was the favorite pastime. Inside the walls, the emperor and his court were busy with everything from running the empire to, well, plotting and gossiping. Think of it as the original reality TV, but with silk robes and deadly consequences. Emperor Kangxi and Emperor Kanzalong, the dynasty's golden boys. Not all Qing rulers were disasters. Kangxi and Chenzalong were like the dynasty's golden children, long-reigning emperors who presided over periods of peace, prosperity, and massive art collections. Kangxi ruled for 61 years, longer than most people keep a gym membership, and was known for his intelligence, curiosity, and ability to squash rebellions faster than you can say Q haircut. Kang Long, Kangshi's grandson, ruled for 60 years and was famous for his extravagant lifestyle and cultural patronage. Basically, he was the kind of guy who'd throw lavish parties with hundreds of guests and then write poems about how great he was at throwing parties. But then came the bad timing. Here's the catch. All this greatness was followed by some seriously bad timing. By the 19th century, the Qing faced opium wars. When Britain decided China needed a new kind of herbal remedy, and China said, "No thanks," which led to military conflict and humiliating defeats. Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest civil wars in history, with millions dying in a revolt led by a man who claimed he was Jesus's younger brother. That's some dramatic family rivalry. Foreign encroachments. Western powers and Japan carved out spheres of influence, turning China into a geopolitical piñata. Through it all, the Qing emperors still insisted on maintaining the Q and their rituals, even as the empire crumbled around them. Empress Dowager Cixi, the ultimate power player. Then there was Empress Dowager Cixi, the ultimate behind-the-scenes boss lady. She ruled as regent for decades, controlled the throne through puppet emperors, and was known for her love of extravagant luxury, stubborn refusal to modernize fast enough, ability to survive palace intrigues that would have ended lesser mortals. Legend has it that Cixi once declared, "Let them eat opium," which may or may not be true, but it captures the attitude of an empire clinging to old ways while the world passed it by. Qing dynasty legacy, great hair, grand palaces, and a lesson in adaptation. The Qing dynasty left behind the iconic Q hairstyle, a reminder of cultural control gone too far. The awe-inspiring Forbidden City, a symbol of imperial grandeur and exclusivity, a cautionary tale about the dangers of resisting change and bad timing in world politics. So, if you're ever tempted to complain about your bad haircut or stubborn relatives, just remember the Qing dynasty, where the wrong hair could literally cost you your head, and stubborn rulers watched their empire unravel while clutching onto the past like a badly braided ponytail. How to survive or not a medieval siege. Spoiler, you probably don't so. You've woken up in a medieval walled city. Good news, you live in a castle town with walls tall enough to make climbers cry. Bad news, an army just showed up outside those walls with ladders, siege towers, and the kind of mood that says, "We're not here for a friendly chat." Welcome to the glamorous, gut-wrenching, gloriously gross world of medieval sieges, where you learn very quickly that the phrase "under siege" is not a metaphor, it's a lifestyle, a bad one. Day 1. Lock the gates and panic quietly. Now with 300% more screaming goats, it starts with a rumor. A farmer stumbles into town, eyes wide, covered in what you pray is mud, yelling something about an army coming over the hill. He's followed by a chicken, not his chicken, just a chicken. That's when you know it's real. When the poultry flees, within minutes, the countryside turns into a chaotic game of medieval musical chairs. Only instead of music, there's shouting, clanging armor, and crying babies. Everyone sprints for the safety of the town's walls, and you do the same, dragging your worldly belongings, a half sack of flour, a rusty cooking pot, and your one decent spoon. The guards, bless them, are hastily pulling up the drawbridge and pushing shut the massive wooden gates that somehow feel much too thin for what's coming. They slam shut with a satisfying thud that screams temporary safety and whispers permanent regret. Welcome to the human sardine can inside the city. Panic turns into dense, hot reality. Your modest home, which already felt crowded when it was just you, your spouse, and a particularly judgmental cat, is now bursting at the seams with 2 aunts, 4 cousins, a blacksmith's apprentice named Greg, who no one invited, and your cousin's cousin's goat, who is very vocal about her displeasure. There's no room to lie down, sit, or even exist politely. Sleeping is now a contact sport. Breathing feels like you're inhaling someone else's exhale, and the only privacy you get is the vague illusion you feel when you turn your back to the group and hope no one's watching you chew. Personal space? Extinct. It died in the stampede around midday, and we held a quick funeral behind the ale cart. Your chamber pot now has a line. Someone sneezes and 6 people flinch. Your neighbor's baby hasn't stopped crying since the gates shut, and you're starting to think even the goat is judging your hygiene. With the countryside refugees pouring in, your town's population has tripled. This is great news if you run a business selling plague masks, but not so much if you value clean air or uninfested straw. Among your new roommates are one man who coughs like he's inventing tuberculosis, a woman who insists that rubbing onions on your chest prevents war, a bard who only knows one song, and it's 12 verses too long. And because it's 1347, and germ theory is still centuries away, everyone is just sort of vibing in a big stew of questionable health decisions. People are sleeping in stables, alleyways, storage sheds, and someone even curled up on top of the blacksmith's anvil. At this point, a hay bale looks like a 5-star resort. Outside the walls, the enemy army sets up camp. You can hear the hammering of tents, the grumble of carts, and the occasional war horn blast that sounds like someone stepped on a trumpet made of despair. They're in no rush. Sieges are long games. Think chess. But the pieces are alive, armed, and occasionally catapulted over the wall. From the top of the battlements, you squint at the field. The enemy is just sitting there, eating, laughing, polishing their weapons in the kind of smug way that says, "We have months to kill, and you have 3 weeks of grain." And so begins the strangest form of warfare, the staring contest of death. You look at them, they look at you. Nobody moves, nobody blinks, but everyone knows this won't last. Soon they'll start building siege engines, towering wooden monsters designed to break your walls, your spirits and your plumbing system. But for now, it's just a waiting game. And nothing good ever starts with a siege. And the phrase, "let's just wait." Inside, the tension builds like heat in a cauldron. Every cough is suspect. Every shadow looks like an enemy spy. Every knock at the door is met with the kind of full-body panic typically reserved for tax collectors or in-laws. There are whispers in taverns. Do we have enough food? How long can we hold out? Is Greg stealing my socks? By nightfall, the entire town is a tangle of fear, candle smoke, and conflicting rumors. Some say help is on the way. Others say the last town that resisted ended up on fire and eaten by dogs. Comforting. Congratulations. You're under siege. And just like that, you're officially in siege mode. Day 1 is over. You're hot, hungry, itchy, and sleeping next to someone who might be contagious and is definitely gassy. Outside the walls, the army lights campfires that flicker like distant warnings. Inside the walls, people hold their breath, pray, and wonder what fresh madness tomorrow will bring. Spoiler, it's rats. Tomorrow brings rats. Day 10, we're out of fresh bread and almost out of rats. Or, is that a soup or a shoe? You are now 10 days into a siege. That's 10 days of no new supplies, no way out, and absolutely no fresh air, unless you're into sniffing old people and goats. The first thing to disappear, as always, was bread. Good, honest, slightly mouldy medieval bread. You barely noticed when it was gone, until the rations went from crusty but edible to a damp handful of flour that someone sneezed on. Then came the cheese, that precious wheel of dairy gold your neighbor had been hoarding. Gone. You swear you saw him sobbing while gnawing the wax rind, like it was a life choice he regretted too late. Next up on the extinction list, decency. At first, people tried to keep it civilized. Meals were shared, prayers were said. But now it's a free-for-all. If it moves, you follow it. If it doesn't move, you poke it with a stick to see if it might move. You're not above bribes, bartering, or blatant thievery, and you're starting to eye your neighbor's boots, not because they're stylish, but because they're chewable. Welcome to Medieval Chopped, Siege Edition. Your dinner options now look like the losing round of a cooking competition, judged by a blindfolded raccoon. Today's special boiled shoe leather in muddy water, lightly seasoned with desperation. People are making stew out of pigeon feet tree bark weeds. That one weird mushroom no one really knows is edible. Some genius tried to pass off a stew made entirely of boiled parchment as papyrus porridge. You pretended to enjoy it. It tasted like chewed up contracts and regret. Rats, once your mortal enemies, are now resources. At first, they were last resort food. Now they're delicacies. You overheard someone describing one as nutty, with a bold, earthy finish. This is the same person who tried to sell you squirrel jerky made from something that definitely didn't look like squirrel. Even the rats know what's up. They're fewer, faster, and somehow more smug, like they know they're winning. You saw one wearing what looked suspiciously like a button as a helmet, probably leading an underground siege of their own. Historically, during long sieges, like the Siege of Jerusalem 70 CE, the Siege of Paris 1870, and the Siege of Leningrad 1941, people absolutely ate whatever was available, including leather, animals from the zoo, candles, and sometimes each other. No, really. Siege cuisine follows a basic law. If it can't run away, scream, no, or kill you instantly, it's probably dinner. Cats? Eaten. Dogs? Gone. Horses? Sorry, noble steed. But the stew pot's calling. This is the point in the siege where morality becomes a luxury and hunger becomes a screaming toddler in your gut, demanding food that doesn't exist. You start daydreaming about food the way poets dream of love. Remember onions? Someone whispers dreamily. Remember salt? If you thought the food situation was bad, let's talk about water. Your main well, dry. Your backup well tastes like it's been filtering through disappointment and latrine runoff, and you don't even want to look in the rain barrels anymore. There's stuff growing in there, stuff with tentacles, stuff that winks at you. Some people are drinking their own bathwater. Some are drinking other people's bathwater. Others are boiling cloth, soaked in dew and pretending it's tea. It's not tea. It's shame-flavored sadness water. And let's not forget that the enemy has likely contaminated the water sources outside the city. It was a common siege tactic. Throw dead animals or bodies into the river to ruin the water supply. So if you do sneak out to get water not recommended, there's a solid chance you're sipping corpse cocktail. A siege isn't just a battle. It's a psychological breakdown in real time. 10 days in, and you're seeing things. A rock looked like a pie this morning. You tried to eat it. You cried. Your neighbor tried to trade his belt for a handful of dry moss. Another guy is chewing parchment, like gum. Someone else has taken to licking the walls, just in case there's salt in the stone. The tavern is still open technically, but the ale ran out on day 4, and now they're just serving warm water with a boiled herb, and calling it siege tonic. It tastes like regret and mossy socks. You still drink it. Even the town priest has stopped pretending. His last sermon was titled, "If God wanted us to suffer, he's nailing it." At this point, you're mostly held together by spite and pickled turnips. Every sunrise brings more anxiety. You wake up, hungry, thirsty, annoyed, and convinced the goat is plotting against you. You can't tell if it's day 10 or day 300. Time is soup now. So is your brain. You try to hold on to hope, but even that's been chewed on a bit. The guards say reinforcements are coming, but they said that 7 days ago, the only reinforcement you've seen is a guy boarding up his tavern door, so you don't sneak in and drink the last bottle of pickled egg brine. Day 20. Psychological warfare. Catapulting cows and grandma's leg, or what fresh hell is that smell? By day 20 of this medieval staycation from hell, things have gone from unpleasant to what in the actual burning trebuchet is happening out there. You're still starving, you're still drinking fungus-flavored water, and now your enemies have entered their performance art phase. This isn't just siege warfare anymore, this is siege theatre. Welcome to psychological warfare, starring you, your rapidly deteriorating sanity, and some of the most deranged tactics history has to offer. Catapulted cow corpses. Because nothing says hello like rotting beef from the sky. It begins innocently enough. A loud thunk outside the walls. A few cheers from the enemy camp. You think, probably just another rock. Wrong. A few minutes later, something lands inside the city square with a wet splat that smells like death, regret, and expired cheese. It's a dead cow, not just dead, rotting, bubonic plague-level fermenting. This thing has marinated in sun and sorrow for at least a week. It hits the cobblestones and explodes in a mist of disease and existential despair. Children cry, adults gag, the goat faints. Welcome to the ancient art of biological warfare. This wasn't random cruelty. This was strategy. Enemies would fling diseased animal carcasses over city walls to spread infections like anthrax or plague, poison water supplies, lower morale, and make you think twice before eating anything that didn't move under its own power. Historically, this tactic worked. Mongols used it. European knights used it. Pretty much anyone who had a grudge and a decent arm on the catapult team thought, you know what'll ruin their day? 300 pounds of cow corpse. Boom. Nailed it. Bonus rounds. Flaming barrels and the mystery goo. Not content with just flinging dead things, the enemy soon escalates. They start launching barrels, not the kind with ale. Oh no, these are barrels of fire, barrels of filth, barrels of... We're not entirely sure, but it smells like fear. Some contain burning tar or oil, primitive napalm that sticks to whatever it touches, including roofs, livestock, and regrettably, Bob from the butcher shop. You'll never get the smell of crispy Bob out of your nose. Others contain excrement. Yes, literal poop bombs, sometimes human, sometimes animal, sometimes both. If they were feeling festive. These are the equivalent of medieval hate mail delivered via flaming stink grenade. If the smell doesn't break your spirit, the sheer what the heckery of it does, you begin to live in fear of every incoming object. Is it a boulder? A goat? Somebody's grandma? You never know anymore. You knew that guy's head. And then they start launching heads, actual human heads. The first one lands in the town square with a soft, unpleasant thud. You look at it, it looks back, you recognize it. It's Kevin. He used to be the guy who sold eggs and told bad jokes. You haven't seen him in a week. You'd hoped he'd escaped. Nope, Kevin is now part of the enemy's latest psychological campaign. Trauma from above, heads follow, some freshly removed, others disturbingly old, occasionally with notes attached. You're next. Or Kevin says hi. This is meant to terrify you, and it works. People start wearing helmets indoors. Kids hide under hay piles. The town crier refuses to go outside. Even when someone hurls a head through the window with a scroll that reads free delivery, medieval messaging. The original passive-aggressive flyer. If you're lucky, they also start catapulting messages. These are meant to convince you that surrendering is the smart move. After all, who wouldn't want to surrender to people flinging diseased cows and Uncle Greg's head over your city walls? Some of the actual messages recorded in history were things like, surrender now, and we'll only mildly disembowel you. Resist, and we'll turn your city into a buffet for crows. We have cheese. Psychologically devastating since you haven't seen cheese in 2 weeks. Sometimes they tied these notes to arrows, other times to dead birds. Occasionally they'd fling them inside a hollowed-out log like a medieval fortune cookie, except instead of lucky numbers, it just said, you're doomed. Why? Because siege warfare was 50% strategy, 50% performance art. Your enemies aren't just trying to break your walls, they're trying to break your spirit. And they know that the fastest way to do that is through a finely curated symphony of terror, stink, and surprise livestock. It's no longer a war over land, it's a contest to see who can out-weird the other into surrendering. And right now, they're winning. Every day brings new horrors, new noises, new smells. The air is thick with smoke, stress, and the distinct aroma of, oh God, not another barrel. By now, you're numb. You've seen things. You've smelled things. You've eaten things. You used to be someone. A baker. A cobbler. A human with dignity. Now you're just a nervous wreck, hiding behind a half-collapsed shed, with a club made from broomsticks, and denial, flinching every time something arcs over the wall. You whisper to yourself, at least it wasn't another cow, and then a cow lands. Day 30, disease, the real MVP of siege warfare. Or, you survived the arrows, but can you survive the bathroom? Congratulations. You've survived a month inside a city under siege. You haven't been crushed by a rock, incinerated by a fire barrel, or bludgeoned by falling cow parts. That's the good news. The bad news. Now comes your real enemy. Not knights, not catapults, not even Kevin's airborne skull. Disease. It doesn't wear armor, it doesn't wave a banner, it doesn't take breaks, it just spreads, quietly, quickly, horrifyingly. You're about to find out why medieval warfare's most consistent killer didn't carry a sword. It carried symptoms. The bathroom is a war zone. Let's start with dysentery, which should really be renamed liquid regret. This charming illness turns your intestines into a slip and slide of doom. And remember, sanitation in a besieged medieval city is non-existent. You're lucky if there's a single communal cesspit that hasn't overflowed into the bread supply. Buckets overflow, chamber pots are emptied into streets, and since the rats are the only creatures thriving, You're basically living in a bacterial theme park. Oh, and everyone is still sharing close quarters with goats, cousins, goats, and that one guy who coughs like he's summoning the 4 horsemen every 10 minutes. If you're wondering what causes dysentery, here's a helpful checklist. Drinking contaminated water, living among feces, no soap, zero understanding of germ theory, add those together, and you've got a recipe for internal collapse that not even your local apothecary's herbal vinegar with chicken bones can fix. Typhus? Lice with a grudge. If dysentery doesn't get you, typhus might. Typhus is carried by lice, which means the real siege champions aren't the archers or the wall builders. It's the tiny bugs crawling in your seams whispering, "We will end you." Symptoms include high fever, muscle pain, delirium, and eventually death. It spreads like gossip in a medieval market. Fast, uncontrollable, and impossible to avoid if you're in close proximity to other people, which you definitely are. If someone even sneezes in your direction, you can practically feel your body filing a resignation letter. Your best defense, burning your clothes. But you can't do that, because firewood is for boiling weeds now. Clothes are impossible to replace, and it's cold, and you're already sharing a tunic with 2 toddlers and a feral cat. So you scratch, you suffer, you pray, and you realize that the only army truly winning right now is wearing 6 legs and riding on your eyebrows. Camp fever. Not as fun as it sounds. Next up, camp fever, also known as trench fever, or the thing that makes you bleed from places you didn't know could bleed. The name sounds deceptively pleasant, like a light-hearted retreat. Camp fever 1347. Fun, fellowship, and fatality. But it's anything but fun. This was a catch-all term for a host of brutal illnesses, usually typhoid or other bacterial infections that hit overcrowded, unsanitary areas during wartime. And guess what? That's exactly what you're living in. Camp fever comes with a delightful buffet of chills so violent you shake off your shoes, rashes that look like you fought a beehive and lost, vomiting like you're trying to turn inside out, and bleeding from your gums, nose, eyes, or assorted other. At some point, you stop asking the doctor for help and start asking if you can just be buried next to someone who didn't smell like fermented despair. Fleas with ambitions, Black Death's middle management. If you're extra lucky, your siege might coincide with a plague outbreak. Because, let's be honest, fleas are freeloaders with a taste for drama. These little vampires hop between rats, cats, and humans with Olympic speed, transmitting Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the Black Death. Yes, that Black Death. The one that wiped out around half of Europe's population. One flea bite and boom. Welcome to the world of buboes, necrosis, and spontaneous corpse-making. And in a besieged city, where corpses don't get buried fast, you get the picture. Nothing boosts morale like knowing a flea might be the final boss of your life story. Medieval medicine, a light sprinkling of hope and horror. So you're sick. What does the local medieval physician recommend? Bloodletting. Because obviously, the best way to treat weakness is to lose more blood. Just a few leeches and a sharp knife, and you'll either recover or die trying. Leeches, which, let's be honest, were just goth worms with boundary issues. Prayer. Effective if your disease is spiritual, less so if it involves gastrointestinal disintegration. Also available, potions made from mashed beetles, dried bat hearts, or holy water applied directly to the forehead, and nowhere else, because modesty. Basically, medicine in this era is 20% prayer, 30% superstition, and 50% giving up. So how do you survive? Honestly, you don't. Not unless you're young, lucky, and slightly immune to every disease known to man, goat, and plague rat. The enemy might starve you, pummel you, or catapult a horse into your living room. But it's disease that finishes the job. It's the silent killer, the whispering doom. The reason historians always put died of illness in the margins. So next time you think of a medieval siege, don't just picture swords and shouting, picture bowel-shattering dysentery and lice-waging trench warfare on your scalp. Because disease wasn't the side effect of siege warfare, it was the main character. Day 40, the final push. We're either saved or barbecued. Hope is a siege tower with a side of flames 40 days. That's how long you've been locked in this crumbling, disease-ridden sardine can of a city. And morale is somewhere between existential dread and bargaining with wall spiders. But now the enemy is making their move. They're done waiting, done watching you waste away behind stone walls, done tossing questionable meat products over the battlements. It's time for the final push, and they're coming in style. You spot it at dawn, rising through the mist. A towering wooden monstrosity, groaning on massive wheels, filled with angry, sweaty soldiers who haven't bathed since Lent. It's a siege tower, and it's the medieval version of a UPS truck. If the P stood for pain. The siege tower. Your worst wooden nightmare. Imagine a 3-story barn on wheels, bristling with crossbows and spears, creaking forward inch by inch, as terrified defenders rain down arrows, rocks, and boiling soup. Because honestly, that soup was terrible anyway. The tower has a drawbridge that, once close enough, will lower directly onto your wall. Now you're thinking, can't we just set it on fire? Yes, in theory, except it's covered in wet hides to make it fireproof. You're out of oil because someone cooked a rat stew with the last of it. And frankly, your aim with a torch from 30 feet up is optimistic at best. So instead, you watch it creep closer, like an angry, armored house party you never invited. When the tower hits the wall and the drawbridge drops, that's it. It's go time. The invaders pour out like ants on espresso, yelling things in languages you don't understand, but that definitely don't sound like birthday wishes. Let's break down the very real possibilities if they succeed in breaking in. 1. Looting your belongings? Gone. That family heirloom spoon? Stolen. Your last crust of bread? Swiped by a guy who already has 12 loaves dangling from his belt. The medieval looting protocol was simple. If it exists, take it. If it moves, stab it. If it's on fire, it's already yours. 2. Burning. Because when in doubt, set it ablaze. That includes homes, markets, town halls, livestock, and in some cases, people. It's like the enemy army has a quota to hit. At least 6 infernos per conquest. 3. Murder-loot combo. The most efficient form of conquest. Why just loot a baker's home when you can loot and murder the baker in one tidy package? It's the medieval BOGO buy one, gut one deal. Now, could you fight back? Sure. If you're a knight with a sword, a decent helmet, and a will to live stronger than your fear of pointy things. But you're a shoemaker with rickets, a limp, and a stick you've named Sir Pokelot. You take one look at the incoming death brigade and realize your options are throw a rock and pray, pretend to be dead again, or yell, I surrender, in 8 different accents to see which one works. The wall turns into chaos. Flames climb higher. Smoke fills your lungs. The tower groans as more troops spill out. Somewhere nearby, your neighbor is swinging a frying pan at a professional soldier. Spoiler, the frying pan loses. But then, trumpets, actual trumpets. Just when it seems like all hope is cooked medium rare, you hear it. A distant sound, faint at first, then growing louder. Trumpets, not in your imagination. Not a hallucination brought on by drinking water with questionable floaties. Real, shiny, brass-sounding hope. You rush to the walls, eyes wide, and there, galloping across the horizon like the most punctual miracle in history, reinforcements, your army, late, disheveled, but very much here. They crash into the enemy from behind, like the cavalry charge you dreamed of during every miserable rat dinner. The besiegers panic, soldiers scream, some try to flee, some fight and fail, others are flattened by horses that didn't get the walk-around memo. The siege is broken, the gates creak open, survivors stumble out, blinking like moles covered in filth and trauma. You've made it, somehow, and now you have to rebuild what's left of your life. Half your home is gone, the bakery exploded, the well has been declared a public health crime scene, you haven't bathed in 6 weeks, and every time you hear a moo, you drop to the floor in full panic mode. But still, you're alive. You made it through boiling plague water, catapulted livestock, siege towers, food shortages, and an unfortunate incident involving experimental pigeon broth. You deserve a medal, or at least a bath. So what's next? Easy. Rebuild. Mourn. Scrub the walls. And hope you never ever hear the words siege tower again, without needing a stiff drink and a good therapist. Not that those exist yet, because the only thing worse than a siege is another one. Final thoughts. Medieval sieges were the ultimate waiting game. except instead of Netflix and snacks, it was starvation, dysentery, and trebuchet-launched trauma. So next time you complain about slow internet, remember, at least no one's outside catapulting your neighbor's goat into your living room. The fall of the Aztecs, gold gods, and really bad visitors. Before the Spanish ever landed with their armor, horses, and deeply suspicious facial hair, there stood a city that would have made any Renaissance noble weep with architectural jealousy. Tenochtitlan, the glittering, humming capital of the Aztec Empire, built smack dab in the middle of Lake Texcoco. It wasn't just a city, it was a feat of human imagination. Imagine waking up on a misty morning, hearing the gentle splash of canoes paddling through aquamarine canals, the smell of roasting maize and spicy chocolate wafting through the air, while golden sunlight glints off massive temple pyramids in the distance. Welcome to Tenochtitlan, where every direction was either a dazzling view or a deity demanding attention. Let's talk logistics first. This place was floating, sort of. The Aztecs didn't just build a city on the edge of a lake, they engineered a whole civilization on it. They created a series of chinampas, or floating gardens, that were more genius than they sound. These were rectangular plots of fertile land, anchored to the shallow lakebed by tree roots, supported by layers of mud, lake sediment, and decaying vegetation. The result? Year-round agriculture in a floating patchwork quilt of green. Think hydroponics, but 500 years before Silicon Valley got interested. Need a quick commute? Just grab a canoe. Canals crisscrossed the city like watery highways, connecting neighborhoods, marketplaces, and ceremonial centers. Even waste management had a system. They separated clean water from dirty water, used aqueducts, and knew how to compost before it was trendy. At its peak, Tenochtitlan had a population of 200,000 to 300,000 people, more than most European capitals at the time. For comparison, London, in the early 1500s, barely scraped 50,000 people, and many of them had fleas with better hygiene. But in Tenochtitlan, the streets were regularly cleaned, and garbage was collected. That's right, the Aztecs had municipal sanitation, while parts of Europe were still throwing chamber pots out the window, and yelling, "Look out below." Now let's talk aesthetics, because the Aztecs were fabulous. Public buildings, homes, and temples were often painted in bright reds, blues, and yellows. The main temple complex, the Templo Mayor, rose like a twin staircase to the gods, each step soaked in meaning, myth, and yes, probably a bit of blood. Feathers were basically the Gucci of Aztec fashion. The more plumes you had, the higher your status. Warriors earned exotic feathers from battle, priests donned entire bird wardrobes for ceremonies, and even commoners loved a little flair. Forget your black-on-black wardrobe. Aztecs were peacocking centuries before it became a metaphor. And oh, the markets. The most famous was Tlatel, the grand bazaar of the city, where tens of thousands gathered daily. You could buy everything from gold jewelry to obsidian blades, avocados to hallucinogenic mushrooms. Because what's a religious ritual without a little mind-melting insight? Spaniards who visited the market for the first time were stunned, not only by the size and cleanliness, but by the order. There were judges to settle disputes, designated areas for each type of good, and rules, actual rules, enforced by stern-faced officials who took their job of no haggling over sacred herbs very seriously. But the beating heart of the city wasn't just in its market stalls or shimmering canals, it was in its spiritual life. The Aztecs believed the universe was a fragile, hungry thing, held together by sacrifice and ritual. Every temple, every ceremony, every festival was a cosmic offering to keep the sun moving, the rain falling, and the jaguars from eating everyone in the dark. And yes, they practiced human sacrifice. Often, in some festivals, they'd sacrifice hundreds, even thousands of captives to appease the gods. To modern ears, it sounds horrifying. To the Aztecs, it was sacred duty. The heart was seen as the ultimate energy source, like giving the gods a spiritual protein shake. Their cosmology said the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and in return, humans had to keep up their end of the bloody bargain. But don't let that overshadow their scientific knowledge. The Aztecs had accurate calendars, understood astronomy, practiced complex mathematics, and even had surgical instruments for treating wounds. No, not made of feathers. They built dikes to protect the city from floods, causeways to connect to the mainland, and schools, actual schools, for different social classes. In short, Tenochtitlan was a marvel of urban planning, engineering, art, and faith. It was a place where religion, government, and daily life were so intertwined you could buy tamales while discussing omens of doom. A city where you could attend a poetry contest at noon, offer incense to the rain god by evening, and still have time to paddle home through glowing lantern-lit canals. So when Hernan Cortés and his ragtag group of Europeans stumbled upon Tenochtitlan in 1519, they didn't just find a city. They found a civilization that made their own world look like a mud hut with trust issues. And that, dear viewer, is when things got weird. Let's set the scene. It's 1519. You're a powerful empire, sitting on a lake, enjoying a good sacrifice, some fresh tortillas, and the occasional gold-plated dance party. Then, out of the jungle, comes a group of pale, bearded strangers, wearing metal skins, riding screaming beasts, and pointing what appear to be fire-shooting tubes at everything that moves. Enter Hernan Cortés, the human equivalent of inviting someone over for dinner and waking up to find they've adopted your pets, married your cousin, and claimed the house as a gift from destiny. Cortés wasn't even supposed to be there, seriously. He was sent to explore, maybe trade, and definitely not start an intercontinental incident. His superior, the governor of Cuba, told him very clearly, stick to the coast, no funny business. Cortés, of course, immediately burned his ships, literally, and set off inland with 500 men, 16 horses, a few cannons, and the kind of confidence only a guy with a god complex and zero backup plans can have. What was he looking for? Gold, glory, and maybe divine purpose, but mostly gold. The rumors he'd heard about a fabulously rich empire with treasure beyond imagining had his conquistador heart pounding. Unfortunately for the Aztecs, they were the empire in question. Cortés didn't come alone. He brought some incredibly unfair advantages. Guns. Sure, they were wildly inaccurate and took ages to reload, but when you've never seen one before, the sound alone was enough to clear a temple. Picture a loud, smoky, weaponized jump scare. Steel swords. Unlike the obsidian-edged clubs used by the Aztecs, steel didn't chip. It sliced. It pierced. It terrified. Horses. The Aztecs had never seen a horse before, much less a guy riding one, and it was rumored they thought the animals and riders were one terrifying god-beast. Smallpox. This was the real killer. The Europeans didn't mean to bring it, but it spread faster than rumors at a royal wedding and was infinitely deadlier. The Aztecs had no immunity, and the disease would go on to devastate their population more thoroughly than any army ever could. But weapons and germs weren't even Cortés' greatest strength, his true talent, diplomatic backstabbing. The Aztecs weren't exactly beloved by their neighbors. They ran a tight empire, often collecting tribute in the form of food, labor, and, well, people. Many smaller city-states had been forced into the Aztec Empire over time, and some of them held a grudge that spanned generations. Cortés took one look at this regional resentment and said, you know what, let's turn this into a team-building exercise. He made alliances with local tribes, like the Totonacs, and later, the fearsome Tlaxcalans, people who had good reason to want the Aztecs taken down a peg or 10, with a little gold, a few lies, and a lot of promises he had zero intention of keeping. Cortés built himself an army out of Aztec enemies, diplomacy, but with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. And it wasn't just political trickery. Cortés brought with him a woman who would change the course of history, Malinali, also known as La Malinche. She was an enslaved Nahua woman who spoke both Mayan and Nahuatl, and eventually learned Spanish. She became Cortés' translator, advisor, and most controversially, his partner. Through her, Cortés could communicate with local leaders, manipulate them, and navigate the complex political landscape of Mesoamerica. Some view her as a traitor, others as a survivor. Either way, her role was pivotal. So here they come, Cortés and his multinational crew, marching inland toward Tenochtitlan. Not exactly welcomed with open arms, but not stopped either. Why? Because the Aztecs were superstitious, and 1519 happened to line up with the return of one of their gods. You see, there was a legend, the return of Quetzalcoatl, a bearded, pale-skinned god who had once left the land and promised to return in a year marked by a specific symbol on their calendar. Guess what year it was? Exactly. So when Emperor Montezuma II hears that some pale, bearded guys are approaching with thunder weapons, metal skin, and divine swagger, he starts to freak out in very royal ways. Is this a god? A test? A cosmic prank? Instead of attacking them outright, he sends gifts like a lot of gifts. Gold, feathers, food. The kind of stuff you send when you're unsure if you should welcome someone or run for the hills. Cortés, meanwhile, takes this as a green light and keeps moving forward like he's RSVP'd for a coronation. Along the way, he visits cities, wins battles, loses some skirmishes, and slowly convinces more people that maybe siding with the weird shiny guys isn't the worst idea. They do have cool weapons after all, and seem slightly less interested in cutting out your heart on top of a pyramid. By the time they near the city, Cortés has turned his tiny expedition into a full-blown military campaign, supported by thousands of native allies, driven by greed, guided by strategic manipulation, and completely rewriting the playbook on how to crash a civilization. Tenochtitlan doesn't know it yet, but the worst guest ever has arrived, and he's not leaving without the gold or the gods. Moctezuma I was the Aztec emperor during the moment history decided to throw a colossal wrench into his reign. Picture this: you're ruling the greatest city in the Americas, Tenochtitlan, the jewel of the Aztec Empire, and suddenly the universe seems to be sending you very bad vibes. The omens were downright terrifying. Imagine waking up every day to cosmic red flags waving right in your royal face, fire comets blazing across the sky like celestial warning flares that something awful was coming, a mysterious mirror trapped in a bird's eye, reflecting what some claimed was a vision of doom. Seriously, this sounds like something out of a spooky fantasy novel, but it was part of their prophecy lore. And to top it all off, a temple mysteriously burst into flames all on its own, which the Aztecs took as the gods expressing their dissatisfaction. Basically the ancient equivalent of a Yelp review with a big, fat 1 star, and the comment, "Would not recommend." Now, you'd think with all these warning signs, Moctezuma might batten down the hatches, call the generals, and prepare for war, but instead, he found himself facing a new, unfamiliar dilemma. The arrival of a strange, unstoppable force, Hernan Cortés and his conquistadors. Here's the twist. Moctezuma didn't just send out the army or slam the gates shut. No, he decided to welcome these foreign interlopers into his city. Yes, you read that right. The emperor, one of the most powerful rulers in the world, let an armed group of strange men with metal armor that gleamed like the sun, horses, which the Aztecs had never seen before and thought were possibly half demons, weapons that roared fire and smoke, facial hair, which, honestly, must have been confusing, because Aztec nobles were usually clean-shaven or had very groomed facial hair, and worst of all, a total lack of respect for local customs, right into his capital city. To put this in modern terms, it's like inviting a group of strangers to your home, who then bring bulldozers, chainsaws, and a marching band, all while wearing masks and shouting strange words, and you still offer them tea and a seat at your dining table. Why? Because Moctezuma was stuck between a rock and a hard place. Actually, a rock and a burning temple. One school of thought suggests that Moctezuma genuinely believed that Cortés might be the returning god, Quetzalcoatl. The Aztecs had a prophecy that this feathered serpent deity would one day return, and the timing just happened to coincide with Cortés' arrival. So imagine the emperor thinking, well, if this is a god come back to check on me, better be polite and respectful. Another, perhaps more practical theory is that Moctezuma was trying to buy time. The man was under tremendous pressure, rumors of rebellion, omens of doom, and a mysterious new threat bearing terrifying weapons. He needed to figure out what this all meant before unleashing the full force of the Aztec army. And he wasn't sure if these pale strangers were gods, envoys, or just really bad news wrapped in shiny armor. So instead of ordering a siege, Moctezuma played the ultimate diplomatic game. He treated Cortés and his men like honored guests. This hospitality included offering lavish gifts of gold and precious stones, which, unsurprisingly, only made the conquistadors greedier and more convinced that Tenochtitlan was a treasure trove worth conquering, inviting Cortés to stay in the royal palace, effectively putting the Spaniards right in the heart of Aztec power, under the emperor's watchful but increasingly worried eyes, hosting ceremonies and feasts designed to impress the newcomers with Aztec culture, music, and power. Although you can bet those dinners were tense, with everyone wondering who might get sacrificed next, and not just on the altar. From the outside, this might seem like a massive miscalculation. Letting armed strangers roam your palace, horse and all. It's like handing your house keys to a burglar because they promise they'll only take the silverware. But remember, Moctezuma was trying to avoid a devastating war. He had seen enough fighting to know that bloodshed could destroy everything he and his ancestors had built. Maybe, just maybe, if he was polite and respectful enough, these strange visitors would leave with gifts and stories rather than swords and fire. Unfortunately, that's not how history played out. The polite emperor found himself slowly losing control. Cortés, with his mix of diplomacy, deceit, and brute force, started to manipulate the situation from inside the city. The Spaniards took hostages, including Moctezuma himself, weaponized alliances with discontented locals, and spread smallpox like an invisible army. Meanwhile, Moctezuma's authority eroded as his people grew restless, uncertain whether their emperor was a wise leader or a puppet of foreign invaders. The Aztecs had built one of the most impressive civilizations of the ancient world, complete with stunning architecture, rich culture, and a complex political system. But in the end, their greatest weapon, their emperor's dignity and diplomacy, became their Achilles' heel. Moctezuma II is remembered as one of the most polite rulers to ever be conquered. His approach, shaped by faith, fear, and a desire to protect his people, couldn't withstand the tide of conquest fueled by guns, germs, and greed. So next time someone complains about bad guests, just remember, Moctezuma literally invited the apocalypse in and tried to keep it polite. So you've invited a group of armed strangers into your home, hoping for peace and maybe a little cultural exchange. What could possibly go wrong? Well, if you're the Aztecs, everything. Once Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors settled into Tenochtitlan, the situation quickly turned from awkward guest to full-blown nightmare. Cortés wasn't content to just admire the city's floating gardens and giant pyramids. No, he decided to basically take Moctezuma hostage. That's right. The very emperor who had welcomed him was now more like a puppet on a string, with Cortés pulling all the imperial levers from behind the scenes. For a moment, it might have looked like things were under control. Cortés was playing the long game, ruling through Moctezuma and keeping up appearances. But as history loves to remind us, power held by strangers and backed by muskets and horses rarely stays peaceful for long. Things took a sharp turn for the worse when Cortés received word that the Spanish governor in Cuba had sent a military expedition to arrest him. Because Cortés had gone rogue, he'd disobeyed orders, ignored direct commands, and was basically rewriting the rulebook on how to conquer an empire. Faced with this threat, Cortés had to leave Tenochtitlan to deal with the incoming Spanish forces. This left his men in the city, men not exactly known for their tact or diplomacy. What happened next? Let's just say the conquistadors' idea of making friends involved a massacre of Aztec nobles during a religious festival. Yes, during a sacred event filled with priests and dignitaries, Cortés' men decided to go full party crashers mode with swords, violence, and total disregard for subtlety. Unsurprisingly, the Aztecs were not thrilled. This massacre triggered a massive rebellion. The city erupted in chaos. Cortés' men found themselves under siege, in a place that had once welcomed them with open arms, and probably some very confused looks. It was a total disaster. Meanwhile, poor Moctezuma, the polite emperor, was caught in the middle. Trying to calm his people down, he stepped out to speak to the angry crowd. Unfortunately for him, the crowd was so furious, they didn't want words. They wanted action, and what they had on hand were real, solid rocks, which they hurled at their once beloved ruler. Moctezuma's reign ended shortly after that day. The exact cause of his death remains a bit murky. Was he killed by the angry mob, assassinated by his captors, or did he just lose the will to live? History's not entirely sure, but one thing's clear. He became the ultimate least favorite emperor in Aztec history. With the rebellion in full swing and their puppet emperor gone, Cortés and his men were in a tight spot. They had to escape the city, and fast. Under cover of darkness, they packed up what they could, dragged the wounded, and snuck out through the canals and narrow streets. This disastrous retreat is forever remembered as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows. Why such a grim name? Because it wasn't just sorrow over the heavy losses of Spanish soldiers, though the conquistadors lost hundreds that night. It was also sorrow over the gold and treasure they had painstakingly collected. See, gold doesn't float, as they fled across the causeways leading away from Tenochtitlan. The Spaniards tried to carry as much loot as possible, including gold plates, jewels, and priceless artifacts. But in the chaos, many of these treasures slipped from their hands and sank into the murky lake waters below. So, not only were they running for their lives, they were losing their shiny prizes, something Cortés reportedly mourned with genuine distress. Imagine the conquistador equivalent of dropping your phone in a lake, except instead of data loss, it was tons of precious metals worth a fortune. La Noche Triste became a legendary low point. The Spaniards had underestimated the resilience and fury of the Aztecs. The city they thought they could easily control was a fortress of fierce resistance and deep cultural pride. For a while it looked like Cortés had lost his chance to conquer the Aztec Empire, but the story didn't end there. Despite this crushing defeat, Cortés regrouped, formed new alliances with other indigenous groups who hated the Aztecs, and armed with new troops and the devastating impact of smallpox, he prepared to return. But in that moment, during La Noche Triste, the Aztecs had shown the world that they weren't going down without a fight. This chapter of history reminds us that conquest isn't just about weapons and numbers. It's a brutal game of politics, betrayal, and sometimes terrible hospitality. Inviting Cortés into Tenochtitlan wasn't a simple mistake. It was a desperate gamble by Moctezuma, made under cosmic pressure and spiritual confusion. The fallout was tragic, chaotic, and unforgettable. So next time you hear about the fall of the Aztecs, remember, it wasn't just steel and disease that broke an empire. It was a perfect storm of cultural collision, misunderstanding, and one really, really bad party. While Hernán Cortés was busy regrouping, rallying his indigenous allies, and plotting the next phase of his campaign, a far deadlier, invisible visitor was already making its own merciless conquest inside Tenochtitlan. This unwelcome guest wasn't wielding a sword or riding a horse. It didn't wave a flag or shout demands. No, this conqueror was microscopic, relentless, and utterly indifferent to human politics and power struggles. It was smallpox, the real conquistador. Unlike Cortés and his men, smallpox didn't care about honor, diplomacy, or betrayal. It wasn't interested in alliances or gold. It didn't hesitate, negotiate, or even notice the cultural upheaval surrounding it. It simply spread, with horrifying speed and efficiency, like an unstoppable force of nature. Imagine this, a bustling city of hundreds of thousands, already staggering under the weight of war, siege, and political chaos. The streets still echoed with the cries of battle and the mourning for Moctezuma. The population was stressed, hungry, and desperate. And then, without warning, people started falling ill in droves. Smallpox hit the Aztecs with brutal intensity. The symptoms were terrifying: fever, exhaustion, and the hallmark pustules that turned skin into a blistered map of pain. Eyes swelled shut, breathing became difficult, and the infected suffered horribly. But the suffering wasn't just physical. Smallpox brought with it despair and fear on a scale the city had never seen. Because the Aztecs had no immunity. No one in the Americas had ever encountered this deadly virus before. Their immune systems, evolved in isolation for thousands of years, had no defense. It was like watching an entire civilization slowly being erased, one fevered, blistered body at a time. Estimates vary, but historians believe smallpox killed up to half the population of Tenochtitlan within just a few months. That's hundreds of thousands of people, men, women, children, priests, warriors, and elders, snatched away in a merciless wave. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Aztecs were already reeling from betrayal and internal chaos. Moctezuma was dead. The city was still resisting Spanish forces, but morale was crumbling. Now, in the midst of this turmoil, the people had to face an enemy that couldn't be fought with weapons or strategies. Smallpox didn't just kill bodies. It broke spirits. Families lost entire generations in weeks. Skilled artisans, priests who tended sacred temples, and warriors defending their city, all felled by the invisible scourge. The smell of sickness and death filled the air. The canals and streets became graveyards. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned or quarantined, as fear spread almost as fast as the disease itself. This wasn't just an epidemic, it was a catastrophic collapse. And how did smallpox arrive? Almost certainly from one unlucky Spanish soldier or sailor who brought the virus unknowingly. Maybe someone coughed. Maybe a contaminated blanket was left behind. We'll never know the exact moment, but the consequences were devastating. In a cruel twist of fate, the virus became a secret weapon of conquest, far deadlier than any cannon or sword. Cortés and his men could take credit for battles and political trickery, but it was smallpox that truly crippled the Aztec Empire. Even the new emperor, Cuitlahuac, who had taken over after Moctezuma's death, succumbed to smallpox. Leadership was decapitated. The city's ability to resist fractured. Without a strong ruler or unified front, the Aztec resistance weakened dramatically. The psychological impact was immense. To the Aztecs, who believed deeply in the power of their gods and omens, this invisible killer was unfathomable, a punishment worse than any enemy army. Smallpox changed the course of history. It opened the door for Cortés to launch his final assault on a city already on its knees. By the time the siege of Tenochtitlan began in earnest, smallpox had done much of the work. The population was decimated, communities broken, and morale shattered. It's important to remember that this devastating outbreak was no act of deliberate biological warfare, at least not in the way we understand it today. It was a tragic accident of contact between two worlds that had been separated for millennia. Yet the consequences were profound. The Aztec Empire, one of the greatest civilizations in the Americas, was forever changed, not just by steel and gunpowder, but by a tiny virus that reshaped the fate of millions. So next time you hear about the Spanish conquest, don't just think of swords and horses. Think of smallpox, the silent, deadly conqueror that did what no army could. A grim reminder that sometimes history's biggest turning points come not from human hands, but from forces unseen. By the year 1521, the tides of fortune had shifted dramatically against Tenochtitlan. Hernán Cortés wasn't coming back with a handful of conquistadors anymore. No, he had gathered a massive army, composed mostly of native allies, tribes and peoples who had long resented Aztec domination, and saw the Spanish as a chance to overturn the empire's iron grip. Cortés also brought siege weapons, cannons that roared like thunder and shattered stone, and a ruthlessness sharpened by years of brutal conflict. What followed was nothing short of a brutal, relentless siege that lasted for 3 agonizing months. This wasn't some quick skirmish or flashy battle with swords clashing and heroes charging. This was a war of attrition, starvation, and despair, where every day was a fight for survival. First, the Spanish and their allies cut off the water supply to the city. Tenochtitlan was built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by causeways, narrow roads over water. The Spaniards destroyed or blocked these causeways, choking off the flow of fresh water and food. The city, once a marvel of engineering with its chinampas, floating gardens and canals bustling with canoes, began to suffocate. Food grew scarce. People rationed what little they had. Hunger gnawed at every stomach. Starvation set in, turning the proud citizens into desperate survivors. Mothers hid scraps from their children. Elders gave up their own portions so younger warriors could keep fighting. Disease, which had already begun its devastating work with smallpox, continued to spread unchecked. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of a besieged city became a perfect breeding ground for sickness. People who were already weak fell ill faster, and many simply gave up. The psychological toll was just as cruel. Imagine living in a city where every day brings more death, where the temples and palaces you once revered are now targets, and where the once vibrant markets, home to hundreds of thousands, are silent and empty. Tenochtitlan, the shining jewel of the Aztec Empire, was turning into a graveyard. Fierce fighting erupted as the Spaniards and their allies pushed through the city's defenses. The Aztecs fought with remarkable bravery and desperation. They understood that losing Tenochtitlan meant the end of their world, their gods, and their way of life. But it wasn't enough. The superior weaponry of the Spanish, steel swords, guns, and cannons, combined with their native allies and the devastation wrought by disease, overwhelmed the defenders. When the Spanish finally breached the city walls, the first thing they noticed wasn't the grandeur or the artistry of Tenochtitlan's architecture. Instead, they saw ruins, destruction, and death. But what happened next is one of history's saddest ironies. Instead of preserving or respecting the city, the conquerors set about dismantling it. The magnificent temples, those soaring pyramids dedicated to gods like Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, were torn down stone by stone. The blocks of volcanic rock, carefully carved and positioned by generations of Aztec builders, were hauled off and reused to build churches and colonial buildings, symbols of a new imposed religion and regime. Canals that once crisscrossed the city like veins, allowing easy movement of people and goods, were filled in. The lake itself, so central to Aztec life, was drained over the coming decades. The watery city, vibrant and alive, slowly vanished beneath mud and stone. This was a deliberate erasure, an attempt to wipe away not just a political power but the very culture and identity of the Aztec people. The Aztec Empire, one of the most complex and powerful civilizations ever to flourish in the Americas, was no more. Its people were scattered, enslaved, or killed. Its gods were replaced by Christian saints. Its city transformed into what would become Mexico City, the capital of New Spain. For all the glory and might that Tenochtitlan once held, it fell not just by sword and cannon, but by siege, starvation, disease, and cultural obliteration. And yet, even in defeat, the spirit of the Aztecs endured, in the stories passed down, in the art, in the very DNA of the people who survived. The fall of Tenochtitlan marks a turning point, not just for the Aztecs, but for the entire continent. It opened the door to centuries of colonization, cultural transformation, and tragic loss. But it also reminds us how powerful human resilience can be. Because though the city burned, though the empire fell, the legacy of the Aztecs remains alive today. So when you think of Tenochtitlan, don't just picture a lost city that burned to ash. Picture a civilization that shaped an entire continent, and whose echoes continue to resonate in modern Mexico and beyond. So after all the blood, fire, betrayal, and heartbreak, Hernán Cortés finally had what he came for: gold, or, well, sort of gold. Not the mountain of shiny treasure he had dreamed about back in Spain. Most of it, legend has it, ended up scattered in the lakes surrounding Tenochtitlan, dumped hastily by fleeing conquistadors during chaotic moments like La Noche Triste. Imagine that: piles of gold, precious jewels, and intricate Aztec artifacts resting quietly beneath the murky water, waiting to be rediscovered centuries later by divers and archaeologists. But Cortés was no fool. He knew that gold wasn't the only currency of conquest. With the Aztec Empire toppled, he carved out a new empire for himself, granting himself vast land holdings, titles, and wealth. Cortés became the first governor of New Spain and was granted nobility, complete with the right to rule over vast territories and indigenous peoples who had once been Aztec subjects. Whether this came with guilt or sleepless nights is up for debate, but if it did, he didn't advertise it. Spain, of course, emerged from this conquest as a global superpower overnight, acquiring a massive slice of the Americas and all the riches therein. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the beginning of European colonization across the continent, a wave that would spread like wildfire for centuries, reshaping cultures, languages, economies, and lives forever. For the Aztecs, the aftermath was harsh and tragic. Their empire was wiped off the map, their gods supplanted by Catholic saints, their language and traditions suppressed. The survivors were subjected to forced labor, converted to Christianity, often under brutal conditions, and pushed into marginalized roles in the new colonial system. Yet, ironically, the Aztecs were remembered. But this remembrance came mostly filtered through the eyes and pens of their conquerors. Early accounts were written by Spanish priests, soldiers, and officials, many of whom painted the Aztecs as savage idolaters to justify the conquest and conversion efforts. These biased narratives emphasized the human sacrifices and exoticized rituals, often ignoring the sophistication, artistry, and intellectual achievements of the Aztec civilization. It wasn't until centuries later, when archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists began peeling back layers of myth and propaganda, that the true brilliance of the Aztecs started to emerge. They uncovered a society with advanced agriculture, Chinampas, complex political systems, stunning artwork, and deep philosophical and religious traditions. Their cities were architectural marvels, their markets vibrant hubs of commerce, and their knowledge of astronomy and mathematics impressive. Today, modern Mexico proudly celebrates its Aztec heritage, honoring their ancestors not just as victims of conquest, but as founders of a rich, enduring culture that continues to influence art, language, cuisine, and identity. So what can we learn from this chapter of history? Well, for starters, never underestimate the consequences of your guests. When strangers come knocking, they might not just be here for a friendly visit or a casual dinner. Sometimes, they're here to rewrite your civilization. The fall of Tenochtitlan reminds us how fragile civilizations can be in the face of unforeseen invasions, whether by armies, diseases, or ideologies. It also shows us the power of resilience, cultural survival, and the eventual reclaiming of history by those who were once silenced. Next time someone knocks on your door, you might want to ask, "Are you here for dinner or to change my entire world?" Because history, it turns out, often comes knocking when you least expect it, and it doesn't always come bearing gifts.